What's up, everybody? This is DustMouret, and I decided I was going to make another tip video for the YouTube channel to help out some newcomers to CSGO. Now, this video is going to be a bit different than most of the other videos in this series where I actually talk about maps and grenades and strategy and stuff like that. Instead, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about settings for your game that a lot of people already know about. Most people who have played Counter-Strike already know about it as well. But I know a lot of people who play CSGO come from as an environment where they've never played Counter-Strike before, or they may just not be as experienced in Counter-Strike as a lot of the pro players or other competitive players. So I figured maybe this video will help out some people getting their computer ready to play the game before they ever even actually open the game. So in this video, I'm going to talk about video settings, I'm going to talk about mouse settings, and I'm going to talk about configurations, auto execs and stuff of that nature, and then I'll touch a little bit on your actual game settings itself. So the first one I want to start out with is going to be on video settings. Now, I have an NVIDIA card, and most people do. Some people have the AMD or ATI, whatever you want to call it. And that's fine too. I'm sure there's some type of direct comparison between the two. It's a different control panel. I'm going to be using NVIDIA control panel, whereas you probably have like Catalyst or whatever else AMD uses. And I'm sure maybe there's an equivalent though so this hopefully will still be helpful is what I mean. So on the NVIDIA control panel, first thing I want to talk about is image settings. Right here, as you can see, I like to use a preference, and I like to use mine on performance rather than quality. And essentially, I've heard from a lot of people that this really does somewhat help your game's performance as far as FPS and stuff like that, as well as just running more smoothly. So I just like using performance. Some people like to use quality, some people like to use balance. I would say just mess around with it, but I use performance, and that may be helpful to you. See here. When it comes to your actual resolution, some people play at native. Some people rather play on like the old school 4:3 ratio, like 800 by 600 or 1028 by 764 or 1024 by 768. I mean, or something like that, like a lower resolution. It's just up to you. I play personally at 1280 by 720 in game, which is a 16:9 ratio. From what I understand, widescreen does have an advantage in CSGO over the 4:3 normal ratio. But some people still prefer playing at a 4:3 ratio just because that's what they're used to playing. Coming from Counter-Strike 1.6 and Counter-Strike Source, most people played at a 4:3 ratio and not a widescreen one. Like I said, like an 800 by 600 or a 1024 by 768 or something of that nature. If you're new to Counter-Strike altogether, I would say a widescreen is preferred probably by most. It's very helpful. Whether or not you black bar it, which basically means if you're using a widescreen monitor, you want black bars and you want it to be, like I said, like a black bar view, or whether or not you want to have it stretch is completely personal preference and up to you. Also here it talks about refresh rate. I have a BenQ, and so I can have 120 Hertz, and there's other monitors out there that are also 120 Hertz capable. However, if you have some other type of LCD monitor or something else that can't do 120 Hertz, I would say choose a resolution that you can get your maximum refresh rate at. So for some people that may be 60 Hertz no matter what they do. Some people might be able to get up to 75, some people up to 80, or just whatever. So I would just recommend use a resolution that you can get your highest refresh rate and then use that. I know it says native now. I like my desktop to be at native, of course, so it just looks nice. But like I said, I typically play at 1280 by 720, and that's going to be set in game. Now I actually, because I have a capture card, I actually have to set it to 1280 by 720 before I ever even open my game to make sure that I get my 120 Hertz. For some reason, when I play at native, when I have a desktop at native, but then play at the 1280 by 720 setting, for some reason it sets to a 100 Hertz refresh rate. I don't know why. So that would just be my thing here. Make sure you have your refresh rate where you want it and high color and stuff like that. Desktop color settings, I would just use your actual video card settings and don't let other applications control it. That's just me. And then just manually adjust your brightness and contrast how you want it, and your gamma how you want it. This is personal preference stuff. Just play around with it. Biggest thing here is digital vibrance. A lot of people, I see it all the time on Twitch, watch like pro player streams or whatever else for CSGO, and they're like, whoa, how come his colors look so awesome? Like, how did he do that? And 9 times out of 10 it's probably because they have a higher digital vibrance setting than you. I think default is 50 before you mess with it, if I'm not mistaken. It may even be lower than that. Some people like theirs all the way at 100. I like mine at 80. I would say just play around with it. Definitely set it higher than the default 50. I would say maybe start at like 75 and just work your way up and find something you like. If you like it all the way to 100, cool. Or if you rather play something lower, that's good as well. So just kind of play around with that. But that's 9 times out of 10 how you see somebody have different colors than what you have in your game on their game, or at least one of the major reasons. Then of course there's other settings that you can mess around with here in your video color settings and image settings and stuff like that, but I don't really mess with that stuff. I just kind of leave it alone. And so that boils down your video settings for the most part. So the next thing I want to talk about is mouse settings, and I'm going to start off with Windows settings, your Windows mouse settings. There's basically 3 different things that are going to affect your sensitivity and the way your mouse works out inside the game. Number 1 is going to be your Windows settings for your mouse. Number 2 is going to be your actual mouse itself, like what DPI you set it at, if you use any type of drivers from that manufacturer or any other type of software from that manufacturer to mess with your mouse settings, or whether or not you just don't use drivers that are settings from your manufacturer. And then also your actual in-game settings. So that's the 3 things. So starting out first is going to be your actual Windows settings. So I'm going to go to my mouse and pointer options. Now, most people are going to use 6 out of 11, which is basically default, which is basically the middle here. So you can count it out: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I have it on 6. Most people play at this. This is what I would recommend playing at, is 6. Basically, it's just a true 1-to-1 ratio between your movement and what actually happens on the screen, from what I understand. Whereas if you do slower, it's not quite a 1-to-1 ratio, or faster, it's faster than 1-to-1 ratio. So basically, I would just say 6 out of 11 Windows. Basically, you don't want to sit here and mess around with all 3 different ways to make your mouse different in game. To me, I'd rather just have 2 things set in stone and then adjust the 3rd thing. And for me, I like having my mouse sensitivity in Windows set to 6 out of 11, enhanced pointer precision off. If you're using some type of mouse fix, I know there are some out there that people like to use, which basically helps with like acceleration and stuff like that with certain mice. You're supposed to have this checked. If you're using a mouse fix, depending on what mouse fix it is, just follow those instructions on the actual mouse fix is what I would recommend there. But if you're like me and you're not using any type of mouse fix, then have this enhanced pointer precision off and have this at 6. So that pretty much takes care of the actual Windows aspect. So that's number 1 out of the list of 3 out of the way. Second is your actual mouse itself. I use Razer Death Adder 2013. You may use something completely different. That's up to you. Let me go here. So when it comes to this, it's going to depend on your mouse, but this is just an example. If you have a Razer, if you have Logitech or SteelSeries or Zowie or whatever else, then your little thing is going to be different than this. But what I would tell you is this: is number 2 is your DPI. It would be the next big thing. Most people are going to use 400 DPI if they use a Death Adder or any Razer product. There's also a bunch of other mice companies that also have a 400 setting. As you can see, I can't really customize it. I can go 500 if I want. You just increment it by hundreds. I can go all the way up to 6400 on mine. But I like 400. Some people actually do like 500. I've seen that on Zowie mice as well as Razer mice, so 500 is also kind of popular. I know some other mice have a 450 setting instead of a 400 or 500 setting. I'm not 100% sure on what brands do that, but if you have a 450 setting instead of a 400 setting, then just use the 450 setting. This is kind of personal preference, but in all honesty, I rarely see people above 500 DPI. Very, very rarely. Like I said, they pretty much set 2 things in stone, which is their Windows sends and then their mouse sends when it comes to the DPI. I use 400. Most people are going to do that as well. Like I said, some use 450, some use 500. I would say play on a low DPI on your mouse like this. Don't have it way up to 900 or 1800. If you want a higher sends, that's great, but keep your DPI low like this. Keep your Windows sends at 6, and then adjust your in-game sensitivity to something high if you want something high. Also, don't use acceleration. I would say strongly not to use acceleration. I don't know anybody who really does that competes at a high level. So I would say always make sure your acceleration in your mouse settings is off or set to 0, and then in game also make sure it's off or set to 0 or whatever. Polling rate, I typically use 1,000. Most people use 1,000. Some people use 500, but I would recommend 1,000. So that pretty much is number 2 of the 3 different things. And then next, it just comes down to your actual game sensitivity. Also be a segue to your exec config. So this is my config, and you can download this from my profile on ESEA if you want this exact one to mess around with, or you can make your own. All you have to do is just go to this path here, which is basically your computer, your C drive, your program files, your Steam, apps, common, CSGO, CFG, then create a new text document using Notepad, and you're going to name it whatever you want it to be. I name it auto exec, but you can name it whatever you want, and then save whatever the name is .cfg, so it becomes a CFG file. And basically this comes back to point 3 on mice, is right here. Your in-game sensitivity is the one that you're going to adjust the most. I play at a low sens, so people play at a way higher sens, where this is like 2 or 2.5. So it's just personal preference at that point. But like I said, usually the Windows thing is pretty set in stone, and the mouse settings are pretty set in stone. So just mess around with your in-game sensitivity, whether you want it high or low. It's completely up to you, completely personal preference. Same with your zoom sensitivity. Some people use 0.9 or 0.8. I use 1. It's just up to you, and this is basically just like with your scope. Raw input, big next thing. Most 1.6 players that I've heard of that come from 1.6 scene, especially in Europe, like the NIP players, don't use raw input. They have this value set to 0. A lot of Source players do use raw input, so they have it set to 1. It's because Counter-Strike Source actually did have a raw input option, whereas I don't think 1.6 did. And so most people in 1.6 were used to not having a raw input option, whereas Source players kind of were used to having it, I guess, is like the basic summary of it all. Essentially what I would say to do is just find a sensitivity you like, go ahead and use the Windows 6 sens and whatever DPI on your mouse, and just deathmatch with raw input 1 on, and then deathmatch with it off, and just find what you like better. To me, raw input 1 feels like the mouse is a little bit more loose, a little bit more free, and to me, raw input off makes it feel a little bit more constricted, a little bit more controlled, so to speak. That may be a bad way of putting it, but that's just how it felt to me when I was messing around with it. So this is just personal preference. Like I said, most Source players are using a 1. A lot of 1.6 people use none. So that's just up to you when it comes to raw input, personal preference thing. So that basically sums up the video settings and the mouse settings. So now I'll just quickly go through the rest of the config and things that are important to have. So first of all this stuff is pretty much preference. I like to use a classic model in-game, and this translates to whether you use classic TV or desktop for your model position, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when we actually open up the game. This is just about bobbing and stuff when you run around, and whether or not your character bobs or whether your gun bobs or just whatever. I don't like it. I try to make it as much like as Source as possible, because that's what Counter-Strike I played the most before Go. This is just personal preference stuff. Same with HUD scaling, just what size you want your HUD to be. It's all up to you. Audio volume, all up to you. This is what's best with your headset and what other volume settings you already have going on. This stuff here is just what I've heard helps better get better sound in game, like more accurate sound as far as footsteps and stuff like that go. So that's just what I use. So give that a shot. Now this is big here, netcode settings. I know most matchmaking servers are 64 tick, in fact probably all of them are, but I know if you ever play on ESEA or play on other community servers or scrim servers or whatever else, most of them are going to be 128 tick. So you want your update and CMD rate to be at that 128 to match that tick rate. And then your actual rate, you want to just put it at 128,000. Some servers will force it to a lower value, which is fine, but you want to have it set this way to begin with, just in case you can use it and it doesn't do it. This is the best rate to have. Interp 0, interp ratio 1. Sometimes these settings are going to change depending on what server you're on. Once again, this could be like server-side controlled, where it forces it to a certain value, but you just want to set it this way to begin with to try to get the best out of it. This is radar. Once again, personal preference. I like it this way because it makes it to where I can see more of the map on my radar. I mean, everything's smaller, but I can see more of the map, so I just like to have a smaller scale. But you can mess around with that. Crosshair settings, once again, completely personal preference. You can set this in-game, but they also have values for the size, what style, whether it's default static or default dynamic or classic static or classic dynamic. So it's completely up to you. I would say have your alpha pretty high because it helps you see things better. Then thickness in the gap and all that good stuff in the color, it's completely up to you. Whether or not you use an outline, completely up to you. Once again, all personal preference stuff. I already talked about the mouse. Then other than that, I have some other things that I use, like FPS. I have a certain FPS max, so I can have a smoother, more consistent frame rate when I play. Whether or not you have a net graph is up to you, so you can see your ping and all that other good stuff. And that is about it on the auto exec. So basically the most important things to have on this is to make sure you have your proper netcode settings here, and then just whatever else you want that you don't want to have to keep adjusting in your menu every time you launch the game. And so like I said, you can download this one if you want and just play around with it and edit it the way you like it. And that's it for that. Last thing I'm going to do before I go in-game is just talk about launch options really quick. Some important ones to have are high. That just puts your game to high CPU priority. The game's very CPU intensive, so it's just good to go ahead and have it at a high priority for your CPU so you get the most out of it. Don't worry about no force commands. That's just, I don't even think they work anymore, but I just have them. No vid takes away the video whenever you first launch your game with the whole Valve logo and all that good stuff. I just rather not have to see that every single time I start my game, so you can put that in if you don't want to. Just make sure your console comes up as soon as you start your game. Your console's already up. This is for your refresh rate for your monitor, so set this value to whatever the highest refresh rate for your monitor is. For me, it's 120 Hertz. If it was 144 Hertz, then do that, and if it's lower than that, just set it to whatever your max is. I have my FPS max, show FPS, which is basically, like I said, shows my FPS in game, then my rate and stuff like that. That's just some ideas on launch options. There's other ones you can look at as well, but those are the ones I use. So if you want to look up some other launch options on Google or whatever, feel free, but those are probably only the really important ones I can think of. So now I'm going to launch the game really fast and just talk a little bit about in-game settings really quick. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about in-game stuff really fast, and most of this translates straight to the config I was talking about, so I'm not going to do too much on it. First of all, make sure you exec that config that you made, whatever you named it. Mine was auto exec, so I'm going to exec it, but you can just, whatever you named it, just exec it. That way you do all those commands that you have been working on that I've been talking about. And that pretty much wraps that part up. When it comes to options, basically, like I said, all this stuff translates to your config. You know, whether or not you have raw input on, you want your mouse acceleration off for sure. You do not want to have in-game mouse acceleration. Definitely don't want that. So that would be the only thing really here. Everything else is just key bindings and stuff. When it comes to your actual game settings, once again, this is just another way to set all your crosshair settings as well as your model position and stuff like that. This is all stuff that was in the config, but you can also edit it right here if you rather do that. Also, make sure your match acceptable ping is a little bit higher. That way you don't like screw up a matchmaking lobby. That's one other thing that some people do. Video settings, this is just your resolution. I would just say find one you like and then stick to it. Adjusting resolution can be like one of the most annoying things to adjust on all the time and try to sort out, so I would just say find one you like and stick with it. Brightness, I would say you want your brightness up pretty well because it helps you see dark spots and stuff like that. When it comes to advanced video settings, I play on low for performance purposes. Some people want to play on high so their game looks nice, but it's just up to you. I stick to low. I also make sure I have a multi-core rendering enabled. I also make sure my anti-aliasing here, my VSync, and my motion blur are all disabled. Those things are going to hurt you if you have those on, in my opinion, so I would just turn them off. Then when it comes to this multi-sampling anti-aliasing and your texture filtering, you can just do whatever you want here. You may not even want to mess with it at all, just leave it at the default settings, but these are just two settings that I've found that I like that other players have used that I've seen, so I just kind of stick with that. And that pretty much wraps up everything in-game. So just to sum things up, I talked a little bit about video card settings, you know, having that the brightness how you want it, the contrast how you want it, your colors the way you want it, and using that digital vibrance setting to get some better colors. as well as making sure you get the best refresh rate that your monitor can possibly get. We also talked about mouse settings. The big three things, of course, were your Windows settings, which you want your Windows to be set at 6 out of 11, in my opinion, with the enhanced pointer precision off, unless you're using some type of mouse fix that requires you to leave it on so that the mouse fix can turn it off when you launch your game. Then your actual mouse settings yourself, depending on what mouse you're using. So, that comes down to DPI and acceleration and polling rate, which I recommend using either 400, 450, or 500 DPI. Keep your DPI low. If you want a high sense, just make your in-game sense higher. Other than that, no acceleration. Polling rate I like at 1000 Hz, some people like 500. And then next was your actual game, your game sensitivity, which is completely up to you, whether you want to play high or low sense. Just mess around with it, deathmatch, find what you like. My tip there would just be find something that you can control and make precise movements for like battles where like you're strafing back and forth with somebody else is strafing back and forth. You got to be able to make those fine, precise movements. I would find a mouse sense that allows you to do that, but then still also allows you the freedom of movement to be able to make flick shots if you have to, or 180s if you have to. Just find a happy balance between those two things would be my advice there. When it comes to raw input, just try raw input 1, raw input 0, and just see what you like better. That's personal preference. And then I've also showed you how to make auto exec, or a config that you can execute that just does all your settings for you every single time you launch the game, rather than having to manually make sure that they're all where you want it to be. And just talked a little bit about important things like netcode settings and stuff like that. So I think that pretty much wraps it up. If you have any questions, just leave a comment, or you can tweet me or Facebook me. Just search DustMouret, and I'll be more than happy to get back to you and help you out if you're having an issue with anything that you saw here. Other than that, I just hope this helps out some newcomers as well as some people who may not be as knowledgeable